Hello, I'm Sim Bose. Welcome to the Net Hero podcast, the podcast about net zero. People, places, the things that are going on to change our world. But before we get on to this week's episode, two things to mention. One, our brand new website, futurenetzero.com. Go to it. It's got the tools to help you, particularly our learning and index sections that will really help you get to understand technologies that will help you get to cutting your emissions today. There's plenty more on that platform, including obviously the podcast and lots of great advice and inspiring stories. And the second thing is a date for your diary. The Big Zero Show is back, bigger and better than ever before. July the 2nd and 3rd at the Coventry Business Arena. Day 1 is all about business, 5 years on from the Net Zero Declaration, and Day 2 is about skills and how young people and older people can reskill. Giving back on Day 2, making business on Day 1. It's all part of what we're trying to produce here at Future Net Zero. Now, on to this week's Net Hero podcast. Now, every week, I probably bore or piss you off by saying, come and talk to me on the podcast. Well, brilliantly, our guest today on this podcast did exactly that, has approached me through LinkedIn and has a story to tell, which I think is actually one of the untold stories. How do we help rural communities and people still using solid fuels to decarbonise? Now, you might not think that that's a big thing. Actually, it's very, very big. It's big across the UK, but it's also big in Ireland, where I'm joined now by Robert Johnson, who is the Research and Development Manager at Arigna Fuels. Robert, hello.
Thank you. Hello to you. Nice to meet you.
Thanks for getting in touch. Really good to all my poncing about and trying to get a message out saying, tell us your stories. It's worked. It's good.
Well, I'm a subscriber, so yeah.
Good man.
That does help, definitely. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I hope you enjoy the podcast. So it's good. And now you're starring in it, which is even better. Let's go to the crux of the matter. Right. Now, people may think of kind of solid fuels as something from the past, right? The most interaction most of us have with a solid fuel is some charcoal that we have in a barbecue. But it's actually quite a big thing, isn't it?
It is, yeah. In Ireland, there are still hundreds of thousands of tons of solid fuels sold and burned every year. In particular, fossil solid fuels, but this is moving. The fossil fuel industry, as we all know, is in decline.
Yep.
The solid fuel industry is in decline. So people are transitioning over to biomass fuels, to those things, and that's pretty much the story of Arigna Fuels as we stand at the moment. So the story is transition from a fossil to a biomass-based fuel.
I mean, before we talk about the sort of history of Arigna and what you're doing, which I think is actually quite interesting, that there's a need for this. This is the thing that I always find really annoying about the net zero debate, is that we assume that unless you go fully green, normally fully electric, you're not participating. But that's not the case. A lot of people want to be cleaner and they're looking for transitions to it. So right now, you talked about, you've got about 35,000 customers across Ireland. What are they using it for, and how prevalent is it? Is it fuel that's used, as I said, kind of for things like barbecues, or is it actually fuel that people are using for heating their homes as small holdings, farms, things like that?
Okay, it's mostly all burned. It's all burned domestically that we sell. We make coal at the moment. It's a coal company. We make coal briquettes, but we've put in a biomass processing facility that will do 10 tons an hour, and to make a fuel briquette, which is very similar and burns similar to, let's say, it's a hybrid. It's not a biomass fuel like wood, or it's not a coal, but it's kind of hits somewhere in between, a bit like an upgraded peat, let's say. But it's very prevalent across the whole of Ireland still.
And this is people using it as their heating source in their houses, or what?
It's usually secondary heat. For most, it's secondary heating, but there are still a good number of customers that would be using for primary heat.
So a secondary heating is that I might have a fire and I want that, but I've got central heating or something like that.
Exactly. You've got central heating, you've got a heat pump, whatever, but you want a fire every so often, or you want to heat just a certain room that you might have a stove in, or an open fire. Now, we'd recommend always taking the open fire out and getting a stove for efficient burning. But that's the type of thing.
How big is it? You said it's quite common in Ireland because it's quite weird, but this is another thing that was interesting me about what you talked about. In rural places,
Yeah.
the infrastructure of a grid, of a gas grid or whatever, still hasn't got there in a lot of places. And I know people in Ireland who are using oil burners and things like that. And that's, something you sort of forget in the transition is that a lot of people in the countryside are not connected to grids
This is true.
and not connected to full kind of systems to get them on the main sort of fuel pathway. So is this quite a common thing that there's a lot of housing there that has basically built for the days when people burned coal?
Basically, yeah. There's, I think there was a statistic we saw somewhere recently. It was about 1.2 million chimneys in Ireland still.
Wow. Still used?
Not all of them being used, but
No,
they still exist in a lot of households. New builds less so. They
of
won't be
course.
building new houses with chimneys. But then there are those that will build a new house and then put a stove in it and punch a
Yeah.
flue out the back. So this is it. It's not. I don't think it's going to go away, but the system is changing, and it's not the. It's a pretty economical way to heat your house. It's generally for those that that are budgeting on
Yeah,
money.
absolutely.
It's easy to budget on a week-to-week basis if
Of
you're
course.
buying a bag of coal or whatever, or bags of fuel generally, as opposed to the economies of scale with buying oil, for
And
example.
that's the thing that I think is very interesting is that, there are lots of people there who have no choice because they're in the middle of nowhere. And if they wanted to put in a heat pump, that'll cost them thousands, right? And of course, the price is falling down. So, but that doesn't mean that they're happy burning the coal. You said earlier, before we started recording, you said part of all of this is because, particularly in Dublin, there was quite a lot of coal burning emissions as recent as the late 80s, early 90s. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. There was a smoky coal ban in 1990 as a result of smog. As a result of smog in Dublin, yeah.
I can't believe it's so recent. That's crazy.
So high volatile bituminous coals were being sold, and so they banned it for the whole of Dublin, and that had a drastic reduction in the obviously an improvement, sorry, in the drastic reduction in smoke,
Yeah.
obviously, but then a real improvement in people's health. So over the years, this has changed and morphed into finally the whole of Ireland is now a smokeless zone. So you can burn bituminous coal, but you can't sell it in
Understood.
the Republic in Ireland, basically.
So let's talk about what you're doing with Arigna. So it started off as a coal company, right?
Right.
Supplying coal that was,
Well, it started prior to that, it was a mining company.
right, it was a mining company, right? Okay.
They actually mined the coal. So the coal was mined on the hillsides behind me.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a picture of a miner
There you
behind me.
go. That's
So
good.
they don't shy away from their roots in this
And why shouldn't they? I mean, I
No.
think that's it's an important thing about where people are going to. You can't expect everyone to be a tech company that's suddenly there. I think this is very important.
So the coal that came out of the mines went to power there was a local power station on the bank of Loch Allen.
Right.
So that obviously provided electricity for local homes.
Yeah.
Later, towards the end in the 90s, this closed. The power station needed upgrading, and the coal was becoming of lower and lower quality. So it wasn't really suitable for domestic use. So the mines closed at that stage. But Arigna Fuels opened up in its first iteration as a smokeless fuel company.
Right.
Seeing that Dublin was now smoke-free, they were like, okay, well, we're going to make smokeless fuels, fossil coal to provide to the Irish market, particularly Dublin and surrounding areas. After a certain amount of time, they realised that the fossil fuel industry was also starting to be in decline.
Yeah.
There's also there's carbon taxes in Ireland, which as of today is now 56 euros per tonne of CO2 emitted, which adds quite a substantial amount onto a bag of coal, as you can imagine. So the company was looking at other ways to transition from fossil to biofuels.
Yeah.
To a lot of technologies, and they found me in 2010 when I was finishing a PhD at Leeds University at the Energy Research Institute. Very coincidentally, about biomass thermal conversion. So this is pyrolysis, heating up biomass in the absence of oxygen. And I started working for the company in very late 2010 to research different new fuels or new potential technologies that could help the company transition.
So let's talk about this because I think this is really interesting. What we're not saying here is we're not saying that people need to get rid of their burners. There's a great thing about an open fire, and I love it, and I think a lot of people do. And in certain places, particularly probably your customer base, they couldn't afford to change anyway.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what you're trying to say is actually let's keep the end instrument, the actual using device the same, but let's change the fuel that's going into it. So what are you changing from coal? And I know you still do some coal, but your plan is to get rid of it. So what are you moving from coal to what that can be burned?
Okay, so we're moving to, and this isn't going to be good for your podcast viewers, but we're moving to this, which is this is Harvest Flame. This is a 100% biomass briquette made from thermally processed olive stones.
Olive stones.
Olive stones. So the feedstock we use, is olive stones,
Right.
imported from the Mediterranean.
Okay. And then you're turning that into a solid fuel that can be burned.
Yeah, so we have olive stones, this is our raw
Yeah.
olive stones, sort of a standard brown color, and we're converting them to this. So that's what we're making.
And then you push that together and compress it into a briquette.
Yeah, we crush it, add a binder, and make it into a briquette, and that's what we get at the end.
Can it burn as well as
It burns. Okay, so when we process, we don't go as far as a charcoal type material.
Right.
We use a process called torrefaction, which is a low temperature pyrolysis. So we don't change the biomass too much. So it's got more, let's say, more similarities to biomass than coal, because the heat value of coal is very high.
Of course, yeah.
Biomass is half than that of coal. So we're getting maybe 2/3 of the way, a third of the way up towards the heating value of coal at this stage.
The material, there's a term called biochar. Is
Yes.
that right? So can you explain
right, yeah.
what that is for our viewers and listeners?
Okay, so the biochar, so all of this, if we thermally process biomass, we make biochar. Very, very easily, biochar is heating up biomass in the absence of oxygen.
Right.
That covers all of them, but there's a whole different number of grades of levels of processing that you can do to get different carbon contents. So the fuel that we make, we upgrade it from a 50% carbon to a 60%.
Right.
But when we're going to a material like this one here,
Yeah.
it is over 80% carbon. But there's a penalty for doing that. So the higher carbon content that you process to, the more biomass you need as a starting material.
Of course.
So we need 3 tons of biomass to make 1 ton of this 80% biochar. Whereas we only need 1.2 tons to make a ton of this. So there's a huge penalty, let's say, in the use or the production process.
And what's the material? It's called bio, so I assume it comes from things that were once, living and used. So is it any types of plants? Is it trees? You talked about olive stones. What can go into this stuff?
Technically, any plant matter can be used
Right.
to make. And there are other companies that have produced all kinds of biochars from a whole range of biomasses. Now, we use olive stones because they're very heavy, because they're very dense. They've got a very high bulk density. So that actually means that when we ship it from the Mediterranean, the carbon footprint of that for the life cycle assessment to get it to Ireland is actually less than the trucks that it needs to bring it up from the port to our processing.
Because this is what I was going to say to you. People would go, sounds great, but why aren't you just using wood or grass from the Irish fields? Why are you going all the way to the Med? And what's the embedded carbon and the transport carbon costs for all of that?
There's a couple of reasons why we're not using wood at the moment. And one of the reasons is that our process is limited by volume. So the more that we can get into it, the better. Wood is actually very, very low density. So if you get wood chip, you're talking maybe 250 kilos for a meter cubed of wood. We have maybe 700 kilos for a meter cubed. So we can get a much smaller ship to get 3,000 tons. And the amount of diesel that burns, or light fuel, heavy fuel oil to burn to get here, is less than what the trucks would be to get it up to us. So it's about reducing the volume that we need to ship in. basically.
Some would be listening to this and going, why have I got a coal company, all right, transition to biofuel, talking about net zero? Because they see these as yesterday's fuels. There's a lot of people who would not even want to know what you're doing because they just see it as wrong. Where do you sit on trying to, I don't think you need to justify it, but where do you sit on that whole argument that actually, you know what, Rob, you're in the wrong field. We shouldn't be doing this at all. We should be transitioning those people onto, you know, electrical heating or some other form, or using some other renewable energy, whether that be solar, etc.
Okay, first and foremost, I'm a pragmatist. So I'm fully aware that I work for a fossil fuel company, but I'm also aware that the vision of the company is to get out of this. So I'm assisting a company. I believe in net zero. I believe in drawing carbon down to carbon sequestration.
Yeah.
And I believe that the future, personally, is biochar. And luckily, I'm with a team of people that also believe the same thing. They see actually the future isn't this. The future isn't combustion. So even the product that we're making at the moment, the Harvest Flame, is an intermediary product. Ultimately, we're looking to be a net carbon negative company. So the company's put out a lot of carbon initially.
Yep.
We've manufactured over 1.2, 1.3 million tons of fossil fuels at this stage. So the transition for us is then to, okay, now we're going to avoid the carbon by having a fully renewable and a sustainable product, which is the Harvest Flame. But the next phase of this is then to find markets for the biochar that we can produce. And we're actually pretty big in that respect. Like the plant that we've built has capacity for 70,000 tons a year of biomass. We can produce potentially 28,000 tons of biochar out of that. So, and that would sequester 70,000 tons of CO2 every year from that material alone.
And so that would be, is that still continuing to be the olive seeds, or is that other materials you're looking at as you move on this journey as a company?
Well, olive pits are really, really good. I'm glad you brought it up, because olive pits are a really good example, because they're a byproduct from the agricultural industry and from the economic value of an olive. Most of it goes to either the oil or the flesh.
Yes.
Yeah. So
of course.
No one's growing olives just for the olive seed. Yeah. So you grow more olives, more people get fed, and technically, then the carbon that's required, let's say, to grow that olive, a lot of the life cycle assessment is on the value of the food stuff. It's not on the seed itself. So it's actually got a very, very low carbon footprint.
Because it's already been grown. It's a subsidiary byproduct. That's what you're talking about. Yeah.
It's an annual crop.
Yeah.
Feeds people, and there are millions of tons available in the Mediterranean alone. And it's a commodity product. So we buy it. We buy raw olive stone that's been processed to extract all the olive oil out of it, and that's what we buy. We buy the residues, whatever's left over. So it's not a waste product anymore.
Talk about the burning. You got PhD in it. So I got your future briquette made out of this biomass material.
Yeah.
When I burn it, does it produce any emissions?
Yes, of course. Yeah. You burn anything, it's going to produce emissions. So you're going to get, it's a hydrocarbon. You're going to get, water. You're going to get carbon dioxide.
There we go.
And you're also going to get some particulate matter. Now, one of the things that we've researched, that I researched back in doing my PhD days and since working with the company, is that the emissions are far lower for our biomass product in terms of weight, certainly, than wood products or the other biomass product if you just burn them raw, let's say, in their raw state. And this is because you remove a lot of the oxygen from this and some of the volatile content. So when you burn it, it burns actually much cleaner.
And this is where I suppose the whole debate comes. And I think you said earlier, I'm a pragmatist. And I think it is, we do need pragmatism in what we're trying to do. If we can get to that stage, how would you say, and I'm not going to push you on the time frame, but how far are you off from saying, actually, what I'll have is effectively a carbon negative or a net zero fuel, so that I've got the carbon, I've accounted for it in taking it and processing it, but it's not new carbon. And then I do burn it, but I'm going to burn it in a cleaner way so that the CO2 I'm producing is less than what was produced in the sort of getting the fuel together.
Okay, so you're always going to be carbon positive at that stage.
Fine.
So because you've got the harvesting, you've got the processing, shipping.
That's good. You're being honest. People don't have these honest conversations. It's really important.
No, well, it's going to be always. That's also true with wood pellets made in wherever and shipped and burnt
Correct.
In power stations. I don't think necessarily pyrolysis alone is a silver bullet for carbon sequestration. I think there are a whole range of other things that can be employed as well. But it's a very what we've proven is that the technology is here already. So unlike something like maybe bioenergy with carbon capture and storage,
Yeah.
we've got something that works. There are maybe 30 technology providers making biochar plants around the world, maybe more. There's an awful lot of installation. But the markets for biochar, although they're growing exponentially, they're still very small.
Mm-hmm.
So in Europe alone, the market was about 120,000 tons of biochar last year.
Right.
But the year before that was 55,000 tons.
Oh, there you go.
So it's growing, but like we've got the potential to make 28,000 tons, which is 25% of the total capacity of Europe at the moment. But so at the moment, it's still tentative. The markets aren't developed fully, but the applications are very wide ranging. And of course, we're speaking now to a lot of small industrial and larger industrial companies looking at saying, okay, we're using petroleum coke at the moment in our burners.
Yeah.
We want to use your biochar in our burners. And the reason for that is that they can't use biomass because it hasn't got a high enough heating content, or it's not good enough for metallurgy. It's not a quality carbon.
I get what you're saying. Yeah. Would you be able to give a percentage of kind of what you think the actual emissions reduction of this transition would be for yourselves?
You've got avoidance. So it's very difficult for me to say in actual figures, but in the first instance, you have avoidance. So you're avoiding what you would have burned if you were using pet coke.
Yeah.
And pet coke's a good example because it's a byproduct of the oil industry, but it's got quite high sulfur content unless it's desulfurized, but it's kind of a waste, but they burn a lot of it. And unfortunately, that's probably going to get cheaper and cheaper because of fewer and fewer uses for it.
Of course, yeah.
In terms of avoidance, so a ton of pet coke. So I'm thinking back, but a ton of pet coke, you're looking at maybe 3 tons of CO2.
Mm-hmm. And a ton of your biochar.
And if we burn the biochar, well, again, technically that will be the CO2 that's burned from combustion is going to be recovered in next year's crop, technically speaking.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But it's just the net that that you won't do, which is all the other inputs, like the transportation, the harvesting, like I talked about beforehand. So yeah, but that's relatively small.
Yeah.
That it's very, it's probably less than half a ton a year. Half a ton of CO2 per ton of material burned. This
is a thing that I think most people see through their eyes here, right? We're sitting here, UK, Ireland, the West, whatever, Europe. But, I've just said it very often, my family's from India, and solid fuels are massive, right? Mm-hmm. They're huge. Mm-hmm. In Africa, parts of Indonesia, Asia, they're huge. And they're still a very big part of what globally is burned is a solid fuel. Do you see this being a wider play that actually, you said there are several companies now looking into this around the world. Mm-hmm. Could this be the way that we try and reduce some of those emissions right at the forefront in the places that actually are the poorest and the places without the infrastructure to change at present, they're burning away?
I'm contacted very regularly by Indian companies, by people from different countries within Africa.
Yep.
About that's what they're looking to do. They're looking to were they looking to set up these types of pyrolysis equipment? The truth of the matter is that you can do pyrolysis in your back garden. It's very easy. As a very good pyrolysis engineer once said to me, you can make it in a biscuit tin. You can make biochar in a biscuit tin in your back garden. It's very easy to do. It's the scale up that is the issue because you deal with tars and you deal with very undesirable products, let's say, unless you decide what you want to do with those things. But They can be done with a very, very simple kilns. But these produce more. It's this sort of thing of people that haven't got the money to spend on the equipment or the infrastructure means that they're going to pollute a little bit more than someone that can afford to burn like we have here. We've got a thermal oxidizer that completely destroys, let's say, all of the compounds and then just produces CO2 and water out the back end. It's easy to do, and there's a lot of work being done at this stage as well to try and get this technology into villages, rural places.
Where do you sit? You said, I believe in net zero.
Mm-hmm.
And you said, I work for, and this is, I think, the reality of what it is about, which is we can have all of the innovation and all of the technologies, but we have to take everyone with this on this journey.
Yeah.
Is this an area that you think not enough attention has been given to? You're seen as the kind of, black sheep in there, whatever you want to call it. Probably can't even say black sheep these days, but anyway, you know what I'm talking about. It's not talked about. Yeah, let's just ignore what's left of the fossil fuel industry. And yet, if we actually ignore that, we're really burying our heads in the sand because it's still such a massive part of our challenge to try and cut our carbon.
Yeah.
When you meet other people and you talk and you go to places where they're discussing net zero and whatever, what's the reaction towards you from people who might be, let's say, from the cleaner industries that are out there or purport to be so?
I don't think people are too dismissive. I think people understand what we're trying to do. We were recently at a conference over in Nantes, in France, earlier this year, and it was really positive. Everyone was talking about biochar. I've said this before. We don't hide our past. We don't hide what we're trying to do. It's absolute transparency. I will put my hand up and say that I struggle with it myself about this.
No, but that's what you want. This is not greenwash. You're actually telling people what's going on, which is a lot better than a lot of companies I could mention. So,
I want this to go quicker. That's the truth.
Yeah,
and I can see decarbonising the electricity sector is relatively easy at this stage in terms of PV, wind, and all the other. Like making electricity itself is actually a relatively easy thing to do. I would personally look at decarbonising heat.
it's the biggest one. It's so difficult.
Domestic heat, if you've got but then it's insulation, isn't it? So if you've got a nice, well insulated house, you burn less of what you need anyway to start with. And then the other point of that is that if you're burning something very, very efficiently, it's in your own house, you can burn at maybe 95% efficiency. Then the biggest bang for your buck is that ton of biomass or that biochar in your own house to heat your own house at that stage. It would be relatively simple to decarbonize domestic heat from that point of view. There are other things like biogas from anaerobic digestion plants, which there isn't a lot of in Ireland, to be honest. It's far bigger up in Northern Ireland. It's much, much bigger. The industry's really well developed up there. So we need more of that as well. It's a supplementary, but if you're growing more materials, then you need more output. If you grow more food, then you're going to have residues, you're going to have things left over. Process all of the things, sort of tie up the value chains and really put in the circularity of it all.
No, I think it's a really, been a brilliant conversation because you've nailed the thing that I think people don't want to talk about. There's the reality, and there's ambition, and there's nothing wrong with having that ambition, but we've got to move from where you are. Just to end with, do you hope to see what you're working on and companies like yourselves within the next sort of 10 years, seeing that shift from us burning globally still bitumen, coal-based products and bricks or whatever we're doing to moving to this biomass-based solid fuels?
Well, I mean, that was the whole point of the carbon tax in the EU is to do that, really, is to sort of, there's a tax penalty and this is ramping up. So in Ireland, that's the carbon tax, as I talked about today, is 56 euros. It'll be 100 euros a ton of CO2 emitted. So on a ton of pet coke, that's 300 euros. That's what it's going to cost. If you want to burn a ton of pet coke, okay, well, you're going to have to pay the penalty of another 300 euros on top of that. So this is where then there will hopefully be an inflection point where biofuel is the cheaper option. Biomass is the cheaper option over these products. So that's really, policy is moving that way anyway. And I think if people can get a product that they don't have to change the stove,
There we go.
They don't have to change the thing that they're doing.
Yeah.
They can say, okay, well, I can still have a bit of supplementary heating and far reducing the emissions, that I could be doing compared to coal. Then hopefully, that the industry should thrive.
That's a good point to end with. Robert, thanks so much for joining me, and your Irish accent is commendable.
Thanks for having me, Simon.
It's been an absolute pleasure, mate. Really good. And do you know what? I think it's been one of the most honest conversations I've had on the podcast. So I really appreciate it. So tell us what you think. Get in touch. It works. Look, Robert's got in touch and he's now on the podcast. But I think he's raised a very important point. We've got to take everyone on this transition. We've got to make it equitable, and we've got to make it so that those in the rural areas and the poorer nations can get involved. So what do you think about this conversion of solid fuels into biomass? Drop me a line on social media. Get in touch. And if you'd like to be like Robert on the podcast, then email nethero@futurenetzero.com. Rob, thanks very much for your time. All the best of luck with what you're doing there. I think it's a really good job.
To meet you.
See you soon, everyone. Keep subscribing, and don't forget the Big Zero Show is coming up on the 2nd and 3rd of July in Coventry. Get your free tickets now.
You've just heard the Net Hero podcast from futurenetzero.com. Join us as we help you find ways to cut your carbon footprint as we head towards net zero. Subscribe and follow us on social media. futurenetzero.com. Better business, better planet.